Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is August 29th, 2024, Thursday, August 29th, 2024. And we're off to the races at Stranger Than Fiction Stories. And the first story is titled, The Lake of Death Still as Mysterious as When It Was Discovered in 1942. A search for rare plants 18,000 feet up the Himalaya mountains yielded a find much rarer and macabre than what was being sought. In the summer of 1942, a forest officer found the lake, which measures 200 feet long and 150 feet wide. Skeletal remains with tattered clothes littered the shore. This place is above the highest inhabitable point in the Himalayas. It is remote, and the closest village is almost 20 miles away. The only other person known to have visited the lake was Lieutenant Hamilton, a British Army officer who arrived in 1942, soon after the forest officer had been there. He brought back with him pieces of clothing and wooden utensils. His ulterior purpose was to verify if the bones belonged to Japanese soldiers that died as they crossed the mountains during World War II. In 1955, Indian officials returned and they were told about the bodies by the villagers. One of them said, "We were climbing up a steep slope near Trisul Massif when we saw the lake, and all around it several bodies lying in haphazard fashion. As soon as we saw them, the villagers with me fled, shouting 'Ghost!' But I was not afraid and stayed there to examine the bodies." He described where some of them were covered with a light layer of sand, and others were buried with only their hair showing. There was no scent of death, but the bodies were bloated. Around the remains were wooden utensils of a type used by Indians who trade into Tibet for churning tea and butter. An Indian state official was told by frightened villagers that the bodies, all 200 of them, were well preserved despite being there for hundreds of years. They said the remains belonged to a group accompanying a Maharaja of Gwalior. He was Raja Jasvahal, and his wife was the Princess Rani Balampa. In one version, they were a hunting party. In another, they were pilgrims who were visiting the temple of the goddess Nanda Devi. Local folklore said that due to their inappropriate behavior, they were struck down by the wrath of the goddess. According to the book Deep in the Indian Himalaya, quote, the king of Kanauj, a city on the Indian plains, decided to make a pilgrimage in Nanda Devi's honor. He brought a huge entourage with him, including his pregnant wife, servants, dancers, and musicians. When they reached Rupkund, they should have dropped the idol of Nanda Devi off to continue the journey to Mount Kailash on her own. The king, however, wanted to go further and insisted everyone continue traveling with him, including his wife, his newborn, born during the trip, the musicians, and the dancers. Newborns and their mothers are considered polluted until the appropriate time period has passed and puja has been completed. And musicians and dancers were strictly forbidden to go beyond Rupkund. So as the troop trekked past the lake, Nanda Devi became angry at the king's lack of respect for propriety, creating a horrendous storm, killing everyone at Rupkund in its wake. End quote. The goddess's wrath came in the form of a snowstorm or an avalanche. The remains were scattered around Lake Rupkund before the Trisul Peak and Garhwal, close to the Tibetan border. The bones could be seen through the water during the 1 month when the ice over the lake melts. They were all very fresh, with hair and flesh still preserved by the cold air. Beside the human bones are those belonging to horses, as well as iron spearheads, rings, and leather slippers. In 2004, 38 of the remains with flesh attached were brought to the Center for Cellular and Molecular Biology by National Geographic magazine. They included men, women, and children. There were 23 males and 15 females. Some skeletons had matching DNA. They were tall and had an extra bone in their skulls. By 2019, it was determined that the sample individuals were clustered around 3 distinct groups. 23 of them fell within range of present-day South Asians. 14 have ancestry belonging to the Eastern Mediterranean. There was only one person with Southeast Asian-related ancestry. Radiocarbon dating indicated the remains were not deposited at the same time. The ones with South Asian ancestry date to 800 AD. However, they all died at the same time. All the others date to 1800 AD. A different dietary profile is found for the two groups. Both were generally healthy, but there were three persons with unhealed compression fractures. A theory that has been floated is that they died during a violent hailstorm, which is known to occur in the area. It is believed to be the source for the Nanda Devi story. There is one group of robust and tall individuals outside the range of almost all South Asians, referring to the territories of the present-day countries of India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh. The other group is made up of smaller and thinner individuals. In some cases, the males and females had similar proportions, making it difficult to believe they were part of a military expedition. None of them were closer than 3 degrees, which dispels the belief they belonged to the same family. The sex of the individuals was accomplished by computing the ratio of the number of sequences that aligned to the X chromosome versus the Y chromosome. There was one person between the age of 20 to 35. 10 people were between the age of 35 to 49, and 6 were in the 50-plus age group. Approximate age could not be determined for 6 of them. Examination of 20 skulls found they suffered from a short-term lack of iron and vitamins C and D, which is consistent with a prolonged trek towards the Rupkund, where fresh food and sunlight are in short supply. One of the skulls had a fracture, but it was sustained before death, and it was completely healed. Both groups ate plants and animals. The later group correspond more closely with inhabitants of present-day Crete. None of the groups had any genetic ties to groups from the Himalayan region. Later research finds that Rupkund Lake is not on any major trade route, but is a present-day pilgrimage route. The Nanda Devi Rajat pilgrimage occurs every 12 years. However, description of the ritual do not appear until the late 19th century, but there are inscriptions in nearby temples dating to between the 8th and 10th century. The later group appear to be descended from an Indo-Greek population established after the time of Alexander the Great. The group is men and women who are not related and were born in the Eastern Mediterranean during the time it was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Hindu practices were not common in this area of the world, which would not agree with the theory they were pilgrims. It was earlier believed by the local populace that the skulls were of General Zorawar Singh of Kashmir and his men who had gotten lost and died in the middle of the Himalayan region after they got caught in bad weather while returning from the Battle of Tibet in 1841. Other theories are that they were the victims of an epidemic or a suicide ritual performed near the lake. The estimate of how many dead are strewn around the lake range from 200 to as much as 800. Since no count has ever been done and many of them have been removed over the years, the exact number will probably never be determined. Despite the genetic analysis of the remains, a true cause of death is yet to be determined. Many of the bodies have not been examined. What has been established is that they did not die due to an epidemic. Neither was their death attributable to battle. There were no weapons found nearby. An anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania offered an explanation that the area is a graveyard, which could account how they all ended up in the lake, since it's unlikely all the individuals would expire at the lake's edge. However, since they are not connected genetically to any local groups, it does not explain why this was used as a cemetery. The belief that there was evidence that many had died due to a skull fracture is found not to be accurate after the examination of the skulls. The reason for their deaths or how they came to be at this place is still a mystery. In 2009, the Chamoli District Administration had decided to develop the area as an ecotourism destination. So basically, nobody can figure out why all of these people trekked up to, 18,000 feet above sea level, where the air must be very thin, how they ended all up dead in a lake. Good mystery there. Okay, next story is also out of Stranger Than Fictions, and it's titled The Ghost of the Weeping Woman. And in Spanish, she's very well known as La Llorona. She is mostly known as La Llorona, which is Spanish for the weeping woman. Depending on the source, her story can vary, but she's commonly described as being a mother who either drowned her children or they drowned in an accident, and she is perpetually searching for them, usually in the vicinity of bodies of water. She is to be feared because she will drag an unsuspecting child and drown them, thinking it is one of her own. The story of La Llorona dates back to the arrival of the conquistadors in the American Southwest. She is described in different ways, either as a beautiful but sad woman with flowing black hair that haunts bodies of water and an eternal search for her children. In another version, she is an emaciated, thin woman who is always searching for children to steal. The origins of the story are varied, but what every story has in common is that she is the spirit of a mother who has been damned to seek her children. Kristen Maria, the most common of Hispanic names, she is said to have been a poor but beautiful woman who when night fell would change her peasant garb for a white gown. Then she would make her way to the fandango, which were parties where locals gathered to sing and dance. Maria was the mother of two young boys. It's understood their father was gone, so many times she left them alone in order to attend the fandangos and revel in the admiration of all the men there. One day the boys were found drowned in the river. In this version, the children died due to her neglect or even by her own hand. Another version of the origins of La Llorona is that she was married to a wealthy man. She gave him two sons, but despite her beauty, after some years of married life, he would leave her for days to enjoy himself with other women and to drink. Upon his return home, he would lavish his attention on his boys, but ignored his wife. In some twisted way, she started to believe that if the children were not around, he would love her again. She also believed that depriving him of his sons would hurt him as grievously as he had done to her. One day, after seeing her husband with another woman, she threw the children into a river. However, remorse quickly filled her heart, and she tried to save them. The grief and guilt drove her mad. She would be heard moaning and screaming as she mourned the death of the boys. She stopped eating and would only walk along the riverbank searching for them. As the days passed and she didn't eat, driven by remorse of her act, she grew thinner until one day she died by the river. Even though her body had died, her spirit continued its incessant search for the children, and soon the locals named her La Llorona. Damned as she was for her act, she is believed to drown other children. In some cases, she does not spare adults who come close to her. And this is a story, quote, when Patricio Lugan was a boy, he and his family saw her on a creek between Mora and Guadalupita, New Mexico. As the family was sitting outside talking, they saw a tall, thin woman walking along the creek. She then seemed to float over the water, started up the hill, and vanished. However, just moments later she reappeared much closer to them and then disappeared again. The family looked for footprints and finding none, had no doubt that the woman they had seen was La Llorona. End quote. Another story told of crossing paths with La Llorona involved a man named Epifanio Garcia. One day he got into an argument with his mother and sister, and he stormed out of the house, taking his brothers, Agustin and Carlos, with him. Their ranch was en Ojo de la Vaca, and they rode off to Villarreal de Santa Fe. Epifanio rode his horse alongside the wagon where his brothers sat. In the middle of nowhere they came across a tall, thin woman, dressed in black, with a black veil across her face. In the blink of an eye, she was seated between Agustin and Carlos. Sensing she was an otherworldly being, Epifanio decided to return to his ranch. The woman in a low whisper said she would visit him again if he argued with his mother. A spirit believed to be La Llorona has been seen in the Para, or the Public Employees Retirement Association building. Rumors are this place was once the site of an old Spanish Indian cemetery close to the Santa Fe River. Employees tell of hearing sounds of a woman crying and being pushed by unseen hands. At night, wailing is heard by the river. Stories of La Llorona have extended beyond the American Southwest into northern states like Montana. However, she is always found near bodies of water, pining for her children or seeking others to take to a watery tomb. The following is a story from 1888. Quote, "It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The bells of the cathedral and the palace, far away, struck the hour as we traversed a lonely, silent street toward the suburbs of Mexico. We had been keeping vigil with a wounded man, a compatriot of mine, and had overstayed our watch, for he was frantic with delirium, and we feared to transfer him to the care of the inexperienced and rather careless persons who should succeed us. We walked on briskly, for it was long hours past the time when coaches and tram cars had ceased plying. We were in San Cosme, and in front of the great massive structure which the wife of ex-Marshal Bazaine has claimed from the government as an imperial gift to her traitorous husband. The facade of the edifice curves in such fashion as to form an offset or alcove on the street, and before we reached it I fancied I saw a woman's figure stealing along in its denser shadow, and I felt a thrill of compassion for her, as one of the poor children of the night. She was not to be seen when we came near the spot, but a moment later a piercing cry rang out near us, a long-drawn wail of suffering and horror. I gasped. I grasped the arm of my comrade. "Some woman is in distress. We must go to her rescue. We are both armed, thank heaven." But he threw his arm about me and forced me forward at a quick pace that was almost a run, and so unexpected was the move that I had been pushed along some roads ere I could offer resistance. Come on," he whispered hoarsely as I shook myself free from his clasp. "We must hasten. We must go on quickly." "I would not have believed you would desert a fellow creature in trouble," I cried with indignation, "and beyond all a woman. It is not like you, Frederick, for I had seen this courage tried by venomous serpents in Tierra Caliente, and in encounters with highwaymen in the Sierras, and I had heard of his coolness and daring in a combat with Apaches in northern Chihuahua." "Hush, hush," he answered, panting. "You know not of what you speak. We abandon no mortal woman. The voice you hear is the cry of La Llorona. Look yonder at the Sereno." We were near one of the points where a watchman stands all night in the middle of the thoroughfare, and following my companion's gesture, I saw the officer, fallen upon his knees in the circle of light caused by his lantern. The great capuchin hood of his cape was pulled over his head, and every line of his figure betokened abject fear and horror. There was something uncanny in the sight, for the policemen of Mexico are not impressionable material, and through the silent, empty street those dreadful cries still went ringing wildly. Surely sufficient motive for such a display of terror. The sound seemed to float away and down a by-street toward the equestrial statue of Charles IV, growing fainter and fainter in the distance. "Let us go," said my companion. "Yes, I am a materialist, and I sneer at spiritualism and ghosts and phantoms. But, nevertheless, I think there is not a man or woman in Mexico who would not tremble at the voice of Luisa La Llorona." This is Luisa's story. In the year of our Lord 1584, Luisa Haro was called the most beautiful girl in Mexico and the most modest. Her father had brought her from Spain when she was 10 years old, and dying 4 years later, had left her utterly without kindred, so far as was known to herself or her neighbors. She was a clever needlewoman and a maker of artificial flowers, and her skill found ready employment for churchly uses, notwithstanding the enormous quantity of such work done in the convents. She had her little home nest in a lonely callejuela or by street, almost like an alley in the shadow of the cloister walls of one of the guilds that chiefly employed her, and here she lived forlornly enough, indeed, as is the fate of a woman who dwells quite alone, but her days were virtuous and tranquil. She did not attend the gallants that came stealing at nightfall into that rincón apartado, that out-of-the-way corner, and tenanted the midnight darkness of its dusty, narrow passage. Her shutters were closed and barred ere the darkness gathered, and none of the delicate, scented fingers that tapped on those clumsy defenses ever sounded the "open sesame" to the girl they sheltered. Luisa was the despair of all the gay, dissolute blades of the viceregal court of New Spain. Her neighbors in the lonely by-street were wont to point her out with a strange admixture of feelings, uncertain whether to respect and recommend her severe rectitude, or to disparage her as one who is denied the natural passions and pleasant frailties of humanity. But a change came about when the girl was something over 20 years old. It began to be whispered by the gossips of the neighborhood that the shutters of Luisa's window now creaked slightly open, and that her voice was heard at the crevice in the converse with one who came not tentatively and doubting, but with the confident, assured step of a man who knows the welcome that awaits him. And soon it was told about, originated in one of the vague, indefinite ways in which such things do transpire, that this complacent wooer was Nuno Marquis of Monte Claros. So it was that Luisa assumed a new importance in the eyes of those about her, as will ever happen under like conditions. One night, a night when the dashing rain scourged the black walls of the cloister, to the mournful accompaniment of the morning owls in the belfry, one of the parish good men was hastening home, belated through the narrow callejuela where dwelt Luisa, when he saw in the space before him something that made him pause and tremble. For he was of the timid bourgeois class that carried no staunch Toledo blade, no slender, deadly rapier swung from the belt. The night was dark, almost palpably. No ray of light fell into the callejuela, save the dim ray from the little lantern swinging before the rude image of some saint in a niche near the tablet on the wall, at the entrance of the by-street where it opened with blunt angle into a wider thoroughfare. That ray falling through the weather-stained pane of the lantern was dim and fitful, and almost seemed to make the darkness denser and more concrete than the spaces that the honest wayfarer fancied he saw flitting along the wall. Now these might be some of the gallants that were always wrangling hereabouts for the sweet sake of Luisa, albeit there had been a notable falling off in their attendance, since it was rumored she had finally hearkened to the voice of one of their number, or, and the hair of the honest fellow bristled at the idea, for all the darkness, it might even be Don Nuno himself, and his worship, by all accounts, would not be hesitate to spit like a curlew from the marshes one who he might meet poaching on his preserves. So, fearing to be mistaken for a gallant, the honest citizen shrunk into himself and flattened his portliness against the convent wall as best might be, and the vague shapes passed him by in silence, unperceiving. He repented of his own timidity the next morning, and reviled himself for a fool and a coward, when the neighborhood thrilled to the news of the flight of Luisa Haro. Her door stood ajar, and the poor belongings of her home stood undisturbed and in order. All the evidence pointed to the fact that her flight was voluntary and deliberate, and the popular voice was unanimous in declaring that her comrade must be Nuno, Marquis of Montes Claros. It was this pair, no doubt, who the worthy goodman had seen stealing away through the darkness, and his repentance was keen that he had not followed them to possess himself of that knowledge of their movements and destination that would have made him important among his fellows. From that day, her old-time neighbors knew not of Luisa Haro, save that someone whose affairs had taken him to the suburb of San Cosme brought back the story that he had seen her there, blooming and with sumptuous accessories in the balcony of a splendid mansion that was known to belong to Montes Claros. 6 years after the flight of Luisa from her homely abode in the narrow callejuela, she sat in the luxurious home where Montes Claros had placed her, brooding mournfully over her situation. The moonlight streamed through the open window and illuminated her despondent figure. In face and form she was more beautiful than on the day she fled with Monte Claros. But still, she was not beautiful enough to keep the fickle fancy of the Spaniard. His attentions and his interest had grandly diminished, until the unhappy woman now had not much reason to consider herself altogether deserted by him, for whom she had given up all that is most dear to woman. She had lacked no material comfort, it is true, thus far, But this was little consolation to a woman whose thwarted affection was as strong and unaltered as when her passionate heart first poured out its ardent incense before her love. She had not seen Montes Claros for a fortnight, and she was resolved to know the worst without further horror of suspense and anxiety. She rose and carried the infant in her arms to an alcove, behind whose silken curtains lay two other children sleeping. She laid the little one beside its brothers. She shrouded herself in a long, dark clinging mantilla, left the house, and took her way to the central streets of the city. She knew the family mansion of Montes Claros, and shortly found herself before it. The windows of the facade were ablaze with light, and the alarmed watcher saw that the rooms were full of a festive throng. Nuno was there in the midst of his guests, with his proud, affected mother, and beside them a young girl, tall and handsome in bridal raiment. The heart of Luisa sank like lead within her. She plucked by the sleeve a bystander, gazing like herself through the window. "Do you know, friend, who is the young lady beside the Señor Marquis?" "Who should it be?" laughed the man, she questioned. "But his novia, the bride, he wedded this morning at 10 of the clock in the chapel of the Sagrario." No word answered Luisa, but neither made she outcry, only presently fell back from the window and pushed her way to the open street through the eager crowd of onlookers. Slowly, mechanically, she held her way, never hastening, never pausing, till she reached the house in San Cosme, and let herself in at its great arched entrance, and into her own chamber. An antique coffer stood there, an ancient cedar chest with Mauresque decoration, brought over from Spain by the family of Montes Claros. In it Nuno had been wont to deposit, while he yet frequented the dwelling, such odds and ends as fancying he might buy on the way out. Thither or matters in his possession at the moment that he found cumbrous. Still under the spell of the awful deadly quiet, Luisa opened the old chest and took from it a dagger, a curious jeweled weapon that Nuno had tossed down long since forgotten, though its memory had lived in the fevered brain of the woman. Still lighted only by the pallid ghastly moonbeams, she went to the alcove where her little ones lay sleeping, and drew aside the curtains. "Your father has forsaken us, my darling ones, and your mother would fain preserve you from the miseries that await you. To God I recommend your innocent spirits." Then one by one, slowly, surely, fatally, she thrust the dagger into the bosom of each tender little body. Only when the blood welled darkly up, staining the white night raiment, did the wretched mother, seem to realize her dreadful doing. She gazed a moment at the heart-rending vision, and then ran forth into the street, uttering those frightful wails that for 300 years have continued to echo in the streets of Mexico at varying hours and seasons, when the soul in penance can no longer endure its torture, so the devout say. As the wailing woman ran that night, her cries aroused the city, and she was captured and recognized from the daggers she still clutched, and her blood-stained raiment told the tragic story and gave a clue to the discovery of her victims. There was no penalty for man's inhumanity to woman in the Mexico of those days, any more than in the present, and the poor distracted instrument of crime paid all the temporal penalty in this case, while the actual murderer, in fact, rather gained popularity. During her imprisonment and trial, Luisa maintained a helpless, hopeless silence. She failed and faded day by day, and when at last arrived the hour of execution, she was unable to walk up the steps of the scaffold, and not from fright but from sheer weakness, she became senseless in the arms of the bearer. The execution proceeded, but the decree of the law was done on a corpse, for ere the halter touched her, Luisa Haro was lifeless. And however justice had miscarried in the hands of human authority, the retribution of heaven proved direct and active. For on that very May Day, when the woman who had trusted him went to the doom of a felon, Nuno Marquis of Montes Claros was buried, having died ere his honeymoon was over. And now, centuries after it is told, that whenever appears the wailing woman, the following morning sees the flowers on the tomb of Montes Claros withered, seared, and the earth upon it dank and noisome, as if it were drenched and soaked with blood. And that is the story of La Llorona. At least one of the stories, anyway. Now, our next story is out of Cowboy Daily, State Daily. And it's titled Haunted Wyoming, Cheyenne Art Gallery Home to Multiple Murders. Yeah, why not? Harvey DeSelms has never seen a ghost, but he has experienced what he calls just weird stuff at his DeSelms Fine Art Gallery at 303 East 17th Street in Cheyenne. The location is where missing filmmaker Alan Ross's body was eventually found in 2000, 5 years after he was murdered by his wife, Linda Green, who may have come to believe he was a zombie. Another woman who was present during the murder helped bury Ross and was later convicted of being an accessory. These two women murdered Alan Ross and buried him in the basement, DeSalms told Cowboy State Daily. It was right at 2000 when they found it. They shot him and they rolled him in a carpet and dragged him to the basement and buried him. Police had been to the home twice before looking for Ross, but hadn't found any signs of a crime or a body in the basement. But in 2000, at the insistence of a family member, they returned to the home one more time, and there was the toe of a shoe sticking up out of the dirt, as if that body had wanted finally to be found. The Selms had not yet occupied the building as a tenant when the body was found. In fact, the sale of the home that was going to make it possible for him to move into the space was put on hold immediately after the body was found. They couldn't sell a crime scene, the Selms said. They had to wait to finish the sale. Once they actually finished the sale and the family moved out, then I moved in here in 2001. A home with a history. As it happens, the Selms Art Gallery is housed in a home that had an interesting past long before the murder of Alan Ross. It was originally built in the late 1870s, early 1880s, the Selms said. The railroad built this for their doctor's house and his office. The doctor's last name was Barkwell, and historical documents the Selms later learned of also referred to the building as Cheyenne's first hospital. So people would come to the doctor's and maybe stay overnight, he said. It was probably a little bit of a morgue, too, because we're so close to the tracks. Lots of things could go wrong, and they would have brought them up here, so probably a lot of people checked out here. Dr. Barkwell himself passed away in the home, after which a ranch family bought the location to have as their in-town home. The kitchen here was added on probably before 1900, the Selms said, and there was a woman living here who ran what was one of the first soup kitchens in Cheyenne out of the back door. The family's oldest child, Jack Welch, worked at a grocery store and was able to bring home a little produce. The woman would take that produce and whatever extra meat they had left over from butchering a hog or other animal to make a stew. She would serve that out of the back door to the poor, DeSalms said. Eventually, after the ranch family sold their in-town home, the building became a fourplex, and it was during that time that there was a rape and murder in one of the upstairs apartments. A 15-year-old raped and murdered an 85-year-old woman, DeSalms said. But DeSalms didn't know any of the building's history at the time he moved. He only knew about the body in the basement, which didn't particularly worry him. But it didn't take long for odd things to start happening at DeSalms' new art gallery. On an evening just before Halloween in 2001, DeSalms was hosting a painting class in his art gallery. While the artists were busy sketching a silhouette of the model, Harvey was putting out Halloween decorations. Everything seemed to be going well until, that is, he placed a battery-operated skull on the front porch. All the lights in the gallery suddenly went out, plunging the artist into complete darkness. DeSalms rushed inside to fix the problem, wiggling the breaker, flipping it on and off, all to no avail. The lights weren't going back on. On a hunch, one he couldn't quite explain, he went back out to the porch, picked up the skull, and put it away. The lights inexplicably turned back on, and there were no more issues, that night anyway. After that incident, a friend of DeSalms, who had a friend specializing in cleansing haunted spaces, offered to bring the medium to the art gallery. The Selms didn't feel that the house needed any cleansing, but he consented to the idea. They were just chit-chatting in the gallery, and so my friend asked, "Did you feel anything?" The Selm said, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, it's an old house. They all have things going on energy-wise." But the Selms art gallery had next-level energy going on, she added, and asked to go upstairs. The Selms took her up the stairs, where there are two other apartments in the building. They were locked, of course, but she's up there for a minute, and she goes, "Who's hiding up there?" the Selm said. That was before either of us knew that an older woman had been raped and murdered up there, the Selm said. She picked up on that before we found that information out. So that was kind of interesting. The truly disturbing, hair-graying event didn't happen until after the Selms did a little remodeling work downstairs in the art gallery. So the way you go upstairs now is different than where you went upstairs before they put this little addition on the building, the Selm said. When they did that, they just walled off the old stairs, which made this weird empty space. The Selms got the idea to turn the walled off space into a storage area instead, so that the space wouldn't be wasted. They got permission from the landlord to tear out the wall while the landlord was already doing renovation work on the entire building. As the Selms was tearing out the sheetrock wall, he found this odd little red half cape, sort of like a child's Halloween costume, hanging from a nail inside the empty space. No telling how old it was, or how long it had been hanging there. It was full of dust and moth-riddled. It fell off as I was trying to pull stuff out and scared the bejesus out of me, the Selm said. It was just really weird. But so, after it scared me, I didn't really think much more about it. We threw it away in the trash. That night, the alarm to the Selms' new art gallery went off in the wee hours of the morning. The Selms rushed to the gallery to check on things. It was a windy night, and sometimes the Selms would forget to make sure the door was truly locked in and shut all the way. I thought that's probably what happened, the Selms said. But when he arrived at the art gallery, the door the alarm had said had opened was locked up tight, as it should be. Then he noticed that a side door inside of that of the art gallery, which leads to the vault, was locked, but standing ajar. That was strange because to engage the alarm system at all, that door in particular had to have been shut tight. Otherwise, the alarm system wouldn't have engaged at all. The Selms turned the light on to see better and to shut the door. So I was like, "Well, that's really weird," he said. And it was like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and I had just had a bag of trash that hadn't been taken out. So I thought, well, I'm just going to look at the back and see if anything weird's back there, and I'll take the trash out. The Selms didn't find anything weird out back, but when he returned to the gallery, the light he had turned on was off, and the television was now on, inexplicably on. It couldn't have been someone hiding in there because the motion would have caught them, the Selms said. My security system includes a motion alarm, so if there's motion, it would go off. And the door alarms are all identified: east door, back door, and front door. The mystifying on and off lights and television are something weird that the Selms has never been able to explain, though he admits there's been nothing strange since that. I guess they just made their presence known, the Selm said. Even so, it made the Selm even more glad he'd gotten rid of that strange red cape. I wouldn't have brought that cape back in for anything, the Selm said, laughing. The space he moved from at 215 West 17th Street also had a lot of ghosts, or at least weird things happening. The Selms told the newspaper. One of those incidents is retold as part of the Cheyenne's Haunted Trolley Tour, which takes place every year throughout the month of October. The weirdest thing with me and that other location, the alarm went off in the middle of the night, the Selm said, so I had to go down to the gallery and look around. When he got there, the doors were still locked, though, and no one was there. So I walked upstairs. I had an upstairs office, the Selm said, and there was my telephone. It had been taken off the receiver. And this was back when telephones had cords on them, right? It had been wrapped around my chair and placed on my chair. That alarm system at that time also had a motion sensor, and it was keyed onto all the doors. None of those had been triggered. It was just the fact that the phone was off the hook that triggered the alarm. But with no one in the building and no door alarms or motion sensors triggered, it was a complete mystery how the phone ended up wrapped around his chair. That wasn't the only strange thing that happened at the location while the Selms was there. There was also this light cord that had thrown away like 3 different times in the dumpster out back, he said, and it just kept coming back in. Each day he would throw it out, and the next day the cord would be right back where it had been when he'd picked it up to throw it away. There were no doors or anything open, and the motion detector never went off, the Selm said, but somehow the cord was back. There's another story about his present gallery that the Selms didn't know at the time he moved into the space. The story was uncovered by a trolley driver and retold in a book named Haunted Cheyenne. A man who had worked for 20 years at the building next door to the art gallery told Martin that for the 5 years leading up to the eventual discovery of the filmmaker Ross's body, the worker had been hearing a moaning sound coming through a sealed-off tunnel that connected the 2 buildings. It was so prevalent, he had even told his wife about it, though he didn't himself know what to make of it. It was not frightened, but just unusual. The moaning stopped, however, the day Ross's body was finally unearthed by police. One of the details of the crime may point to a bizarre motive for the murder. Police said Ross's genitalia had been cut off, and he'd been shot in the back of the head. As police investigated the case, more came to light about Ross's wife, Linda Green, and her state of mind at the time. She had been convinced she was a vampire, and friends said she was drinking excessively, trying to quiet all the voices in her head. She died of liver disease before Ross's body was found. Included among her writings were some instructions on how she believed zombies could be killed. Those instructions included cutting off the genitalia of the individual. Green died before she could be held accountable for the murder, but she had an accomplice, Julia Williams, who was found guilty of being an accessory to the crime by helping Green bury the body in the basement. Alan Ross's twin brother and older brother came for the Williams trial, which was Novemberish, the Selm said, and we became pretty friendly. Over the weekend they were here during the trial. While there, they kept asking questions that circled a central question for them. Could the Selms sense their brother's presence in the home? Was his ghost haunting the place? By then, the Selms felt the art gallery had calm energy and that there was nothing unsettled about any of the spirits, including Ross, that might reside there. Well, if he is, he likes it, the Selms told them. And then the twin brother said, in Chicago where they grew up, he really liked the artist and the weirdo, so he's happy here. The Selms laughs about that memory when he tells the story. I wasn't sure which I was. But some of us are pretty odd, he said. I'm not very artistic, but I'll take weird any day. Okay. Hey. Unusual place to live. What do you think? All right. We're back to stranger than fiction stories. And this is more of a true crime with some ghosts thrown in for the mix, the best mix. This is titled The Ghost of Crowsnest Pass. At 4:10 a.m. on April 29, 1903, the inhabitants of Frank, a small bootlegging and mining camp at Crowsnest Pass, heard a distant roar. The town sat at the base of Turtle Mountain in the southwestern corner of the District of Alberta, Canada. Little did they know that within less than 2 minutes, a landslide brought down over 80 million tons of debris that obliterated the eastern end of the town, including many inhabitants that have remained entombed until this day. 90 persons lost their lives, and only 18 had their remains recovered because they were buried under shallow debris. Most of the bodies were inaccessible due to the immense weight of the rubble. Although the site was nothing more than boulders and rocks, below the surface lay remains of the unfortunate ones, and above the surface their unsettled spirits continued to roam. It is not surprising that this area has a reputation of being very haunted. Spirits are said to be wandering the debris field, searching for their lost friends and loved ones. Some visitors have reported feeling uncomfortable in the area, followed by cries in the wind and unexplained lantern lights traversing the boulders at night. How many souls have remained and who they are and why they stay is a complete mystery. However, sudden and violent death would visit Frank again only within a scant few years. Like many mining frontier towns, Frank had a thriving tenderloin area where prostitutes plied their trade. Many men came pursuing a job in the mines. Some of them were very violent, and others were downright criminals. It was a man like this that crossed paths with a local madam named Monty Lewis. On a cold November night in 1907, a constable was looking for a man known as Mike Phillips. He went to all the brothels in Frank, and when he arrived at Monty's house, all the lights were out. He went to a side door, knocked several times, the doors were locked, and he left. He came back 2 hours later, and the lights were on inside, and he found a side door open. Searching through the house, he found it was empty except for something that lay across the bed in one of the rooms. When he drew back a bloodied quilt, he found Monty lying on her bed, dressed only in a wrapper and stockings. Her throat had been slit, her head hacked and stabbed, and she had several wounds above her eyes. She had also been stabbed in the chest, and she had defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. The constable went and got the local police sergeant, who came with the coroner, and they proceeded to search the property. They found a long carving knife and a hatchet covered in blood under the kitchen table. These items were later identified by the cook as ones he used when preparing meals. The remains of lunch were still there, and the bedroom was strewn with clothing that had been pulled from the bureau and a nearby trunk. A doctor later determined that her death had been caused by a skull fracture inflicted during the attack. Phillips, who was the main suspect, had anglicized his real name, which was Maxim Plipazuk. He had immigrated from Galicia, Ukraine. Monty was doing well in the flesh trade and was having a new house built. She had left California to relocate to Frank. 2 painters working on it will go on to give testimony they had seen Mike Phillips at the house the day of the murder, as well as 2 days previous to that. Other miners which had visited Monty's brothel had also seen Mike Phillips there. Frankie Harris, a prostitute who had been staying there until only 3 days before the murder, told the court how she had seen Mike Phillips as well as a Mr. Green coming to the house to visit Monty. Green, though, had a solid alibi, as he was placed by others on a bridge chain gang and was working in a coal chute when the murder was committed. Frankie also said she knew that Monty had $200 on her. The local banker confirmed the deposit was never made. Monty was known for her love of extravagant jewelry, and it was left untouched. Phillips had just been paid $103 in wages, which many believed he would have spent at Monty's brothel after spending 3 days there, but all of Monty's money was gone. Mr. Moody, a timekeeper at the mine, testified that Phillips had not been dismissed and had just stopped coming to work. On January 30th, 1908, the police eventually caught up with Mike Phillips in Pecan, where his wife and her family lived on their farm. He had arrived on December 19th claiming he had to walk back after being robbed in McLeod, and he had no money left. He was arrested and went to trial in May 1908. The most damaging testimony came from Monty's cook, Ma Singh, who was originally the main suspect. He said that Mike Phillips had been staying at the house for 2 days previous to the murder. Mike Phillips, desperate for a character reference, even sent for his father-in-law, John Orozuk, who was a Galician himself and who traveled from Pecan, Canada. Phillips had married his daughter only a year before, but had only sent her $14 from his earning the entire time. Little did Orozuk understand the true nature of the man he vouched for. Despite all the evidence and testimony, on May 11, 1908, the jury acquitted Phillips, based on the doubt created by the defense attorney that the victim's lifestyle allowed access to other men who could have committed the crime. Too bad for Mrs. Phillips that her husband was acquitted, because by 1912, a reward of $200 was being offered for his capture. He had killed her on March 12th of that same year by putting 3 bullets in her right breast after a drunken brawl. Phillips was described as cunning by the mounted police, who suspected he probably traveled at night using the cover of darkness. The death of Monty Lewis in 1907 was featured in the stories about him, reminding readers that perhaps the murder of his wife had not been his first. He was 29 years old, measured 5 feet 7 inches, weighed 150 pounds, had dark complexion, brown hair and eyes, a scar on his right cheekbone, and a scar on his left thigh. He was missing his big toe of his right foot. He was known as a heavy drinker who frequented saloons. Police believe he was still close to the murder scene, which was 60 miles northwest of Edmonton, since he was on foot. They suspected he was being given food by some of his countrymen. What became of Mike Phillips is lost to history, since there is no mention of his capture. However, Monty's spirit is believed to still wander through the town, bemoaning her early death and luring lost hikers away from the safety of the trails. Crowsnest's past, long and sometimes dark history, yields stories of spirits and hauntings. The residents continue the tradition of recounting the tales to visitors who dare to ask. There is another mystery that predates the landslide at Frank and the murder of Monty Lewis. In 1870, prospectors from Montana came to pan for gold in the North Saskatchewan River. I know I'm pronouncing that wrong. Saskatchewan River. Two of the men were named Blackjack and Lemon. Nothing came of the project, and they made plans to return to Tobacco Plains, Montana. In order to protect themselves from attacks by the Blackfoot, they joined a group of half-breeds heading for Fort Standoff. From that point on, they went their own way and followed an old Indian trail up High River into the mountains. The exact pack trail they followed is not known, but eventually they came to the Elk River Valley and panned at a confluence of 3 separate streams. They found the riverbed was full of gold, and a rock ledge was streaked with solid gold. At the end of the day, both men argued over whether they should stay and mine or return in the spring. They almost came to blows, but it wouldn't be the first time gold caused bad blood between friends. Later that night, Lemon split Blackjack's head with an axe while he slept. That night, Lemon started to hear ghostly moaning, which he feared was Blackjack's ghost, who had returned for revenge. Lemon's sanity, which perhaps wasn't the best before that day, took a serious turn for the worse after he became a murderer. What he didn't know was that 2 stony braves, William and Daniel Bendow, were making the ghostly cries from behind a bush where they were hiding. Lemon, who had not shut his eyes all night long, left the camp bound for Tobacco Plains at the first sight of dawn. The Bendow brothers raided the camp and took all the valuables. They headed to their village at Morley, Alberta, and told their chief about the discovery of the gold and Blackjack's murder. Wary of what would happen if word got out about gold being found, the chief swore both of them to secrecy. Tobacco Plains once had a small Jesuit mission, but it had closed by the 1860s. The only religious center, Jocko Mission or St. Ignatius, was found south of Flathead Lake in Montana. Upon arriving there, Lemon visited a priest and confessed his crime. He showed the priest samples of the gold they discovered, which left no doubt he was speaking the truth. The priest sent out John McDougall, a Metis, to Lemon's mine. The camp was found, and he buried Blackjack, leaving a cairn to mark the man's resting place. Once he left, men from the Morley village, who had kept a vigil over the site, destroyed the cairn and any evidence of the man's presence there. Soon enough, others heard of Lemon's discovery and convinced them to take them to the location. However, Lemon's sanity was fragile, and he was unable to return to the site. His companions didn't want to believe he didn't remember. When they confronted him, he became violent and was taken back to Tobacco Plains, where he went to live on his brother's ranch until his death. In 1872, the priest outfitted a party of miners. They left for Crowsnest Lake to wait for John McDougall, who had buried Blackjack 2 years before. McDougall planned to meet the party, but first stopped at Fort Kip, a whiskey fort in southwest Alberta. He drank himself to death that night from the rot-gut whiskey known to be served there. The location of the mine went with him, and the expedition was cancelled. In 1883, the priest put together another mining party, but this time a forest fire that had charred the area earlier in the year made the terrain unreachable, and they returned to Tobacco Plains. The priest might not have been lucky, but he was persistent, and in 1884 he sent out another party, this one led by Lemon. However, the closer he got to the location, the more deranged he became. The expedition was forced to turn back. A man named Nelson, who had panned with blackjack and lemon on the North Saskatchewan, led another trip which ended in failure. The next to organize a search was Lafayette French, a buffalo hunter and Indian trader who hailed from Pennsylvania. On the first leg of the trip, he contracted a serious illness that made him very sick and waylaid him from completing the expedition. He spent the next 30 years searching for the lost lemon mine. He even enlisted help from members of the expedition organized by the priest and members of the tribe who had escorted Lemon and Blackjack to the old Indian trail. French came to believe there was some type of curse that would strike any who came looking for the gold, especially if they came close to finding it. What convinced him of this was when a group of Stony Indians, led by William Bendel, took shelter on a ranch near Pitcher Creek, owned by William Samuel Lee, a friend of Lafayette French. French was coincidentally visiting at the ranch and gave the group some food. When French asked Bendel about the mine, the Indians refused to talk about it. A few months later, French told Bendel he would give 25 horses and 25 cattle to the Stony tribe on the condition he would be guided to the lost lemon mine. Bendel said yes, but later changed his mind, convinced by superstition that something bad would happen. In the winter of 1912, Bendel once again agreed to take the French to the mine. George Emerson, a rancher and fur trader, would accompany the group. However, Bendel mysteriously died en route to the meeting point. The Stony tribe, or that are part of the Nakota Nation, believed that Bendel's death was the result of bad medicine after he agreed to reveal the tribe's secret. Bendel's companions brought his body back to Morley in a cart. On the night of their return, Bendel's son-in-law died just as mysteriously. Undeterred by the men's death, French decided to continue the expedition, which had been outfitted by Senator Riley. On that trip, he didn't discover the mine, but found something unusual, since he wrote a cryptic letter to a friend at Fort Benton when he stopped at the Bayou Ranch in the Albert foothills. He mentioned something about locating it. From there, he headed west and stopped at his cabin about 2 miles from the Bedingfield Ranch in High River. The cabin mysteriously caught fire that night, and French was badly burned. He crawled 2 miles in the snow to the Bedingfield Ranch for help. He managed to get himself into one of the beds in the bunkhouse, which was empty since the cowboys had left for the day's work. The cowhands did not discover French until they returned at the end of the day. They took him to the nearest hospital in High River. He was in bad condition and asked to see Senator Riley, supposedly to tell him about the location of the lemon mine. However, he died before he could talk to Riley. Now we come to history versus the myth of the lemon mine. According to author Jack Dempsey, Lemon's Christian name was varied but never exact, except that he probably spelled his last name as Lemon with 2 M's. Blackjack did have a real reputation in those years as a prospector who was involved in the discovery of gold in the Caribou mines in British Columbia. His real name was Nehemiah T. Smith, born in Maryland, and he was involved in the Fraser River Gold Rush in 1858. At that time, he partnered with Thomas Latham, who went by the name of Dancing Bill. In 1862, Blackjack made the famous strike on William Creek. This is where myth diverts from reality, because Blackjack was still alive in 1883, an old man and a patient at Victoria Hospital. This was 13 years after he was supposedly killed by Lemon in the argument of whether to stay or leave. There had always been a dispute if there is gold in the foothills in Alberta, but throughout the late 19th century there were reports of gold being found there. In 1882, a cow grazing in the Porcupine Hills was butchered, and $8 in coarse gold was found in its stomach. In those years, a certain Father LaRue was said to be living at the Jocko Mission close to Tobacco Plains, but according to Jesuit records, which were usually precise, no priest by this name served at St. Ignatius or at the earlier mission. However, among the Blackfoot there was a man named Jean Leroux, a French-Canadian who once attended a Catholic seminary in Montreal. According to the oblate priest, he was expelled because he was caught as either being a thief or a homosexual. He fled to the Montana goldfields where he passed himself off as a priest. In the summer of 1861, he was staying at the St. Albert Mission north of Fort Edmonton, but was caught in the act of sodomy. The priest handed him off to a band of Blackfoot who had come to trade, and he left for Montana with them. Even though he had never received holy orders, he used a cassock and told the Indians he was part of the Oblates order. In Montana, he passed himself off to the Jesuits as a secular priest. In 1862, LaRue returned to St. Albert claiming he had built a church for the Jesuits at Chief Mountain. Father Lacombe at Oblate said, "It appears that he has deceived the Jesuit fathers even better than he has me." LaRue performed baptism and marriages among the Blackfoot, and he traveled with them and served as their interpreter. He took the Blackfoot name of Neil, I know I'm butchering this, Neil Kastatapi, or three persons, after the Holy Trinity. One of the reasons he also stayed with the Blackfoot is that he did not have to hide his homosexuality. This society was tolerant of berdache, a fact attested to by the trader Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, using contemporary vocabulary in his account of his voyage along the upper Missouri River, voyage sur le Haut, which he completed from 1794 to 1796. And this is what he wrote, quote, which is a translation. "Among all the savage peoples of this continent there are men who wear women's dress, who never take part in war or the hunt, who do women's work, and who make use of both sexes. I could not truthfully tell you what has caused these hermaphrodite-like men to assume this condition, whether it be due to some fanciful idea or an abominable disturbed passion, as these barbarians have an unfortunate penchant for sodomy." End quote. LaRue's first concern appeared to be the Indians throughout the years he lived with them. Many times he sought medical help for them when they were stricken with disease or were starving. He also served as interpreter during treaty negotiations. He was relieved of his duties in 1891 and found himself utterly destitute. He was known to be demanding, obsessive, and eccentric, and eventually came to Father Lacombe for help. Even though he was in his 70s, he set off with a bundle for the foothills of the Rockies and lived as a recluse or with the Medes. Poor and crippled, he survived on the rations of beef and flour that the government granted him for services rendered. In 1912, LaRue had to be placed in a home run by Father Lacombe in Midnapore. By then he was quite elderly, but he still wore the cassock and the clerical collar, and insisted on being called Reverend. He died in 1919, having almost reached the age of 90. It's believed that LaRue perpetrated the hoax of Lemon's Lost Mine, based on the following story told by Lieutenant James Bradley, quote, "In the summer of 1862, a package of sand was received by Dawson, a trader at Fort Benton, from a certain LaRue, a pretended priest, who had been living for several years among the Bloods and Blackfeet. LaRue sent word with the package that it was gold, bearing sand, taken from a gulch in the north, and he would guide a party to the locality if desired. The sand was washed at the fort, and was found to contain an astonishing proportion of gold. A party was instantly formed, which proceeded north in July to prospect. The party pursued a northwesterly course, prospecting upon every stream from the Marias to the Willows, a point about 25 miles south of Fort Edmonton, getting a like color of gold upon every stream, but nothing to justify working. LaRue could not be found, and the unsuccessful prospectors, after passing the summer in the fruitless search, concluded they had been victimized by the faithless LaRue and turned their faces homeward, arriving at Fort Benton in September in such a state of mind that they would have executed summary vengeance on LaRue had he fallen into their hands. It is the present belief in the 1870s of Mr. Arnoux, shared by others of his associates, that LaRue had purposely deceived them by mixing a large quantity of gold dust with the sand and representing the mixture as a fair specimen of the rich fields known to him." End quote. The similarity to the LaRue of the story to LaRue is more than coincidental, as well as the legends that named a Father LaRue as the one who had sent out various search parties for the lost lemon mine. Also, the two Stony Indians, William and Daniel Bendow, are never mentioned in any of the 1877 treaty lists. Stonies that were asked about the surname said they had never heard of it. Perhaps Bendow might have been Bigman, which had two members with this name in 1870. In a version reported in 1868, Frank Lemon traveled with his partner, Old George, and they found gold on the west side of the Rockies. Lemon had two stories as to what happened to his partner. In one, he was shot by the Blackfeet. In the other story, he shot Old George because of a quarrel. The body was found and buried in 1884 or 1885. Lemon went to the Jocko Mission, but didn't claim he had discovered a fabulous vein or mother lode, but that he got as high as $15 or $20 to the pan in a gulch. 2 years later, Lemon was able to get a group together and returned to the area, which was about 120 miles north of Flathead Lake. He led the men through a fruitless course through rough terrain until the men realized that Lemon was lost. The party also suffered the loss of their equipment due to a fire and returned without finding anything. Lemon was last reported upon in 1886 when he joined the gold rush to the Sweetgrass Hills. Why would Lemon do this? Is tied to funding. All one had to do was claim to know where gold could be found, and a party would be formed where he didn't have to pay for the equipment, just to act as a guide. So it seems the legend of the Lost Lemon Mines is based more on myth than reality, most of it made up by a laicized priest named Jean Leroux. Hero. And the differentiation is not the pronunciation, but the spelling. Leroux or Leroux. And there you go. There you go. A haunted mining town and a haunted brothel and all that interesting stuff. I will be back soon with some more eerie news. Till next time.